As the campaign for the voice kicks off, there are now competing arguments over whether the body will negotiate treaty. Anthony Albanese insists it's not about treaty. He says the voice would not be about compensating Indigenous people, points he made in yesterday's fiery clash with Ben Fordham. But previously, Albanese has spoken about treaty and said that it would be the next phase after the voice. These comments weren't years ago, but just 2 months ago in May. He said the voice would lead to treaty and truth-telling.
They are very much a part of the next phase, if you like, and one of the things that a voice to Parliament will be able to do is to talk about Makarrata, the need for agreement making and coming together after a conflict.
The Australian newspaper reports today that UNSW Law School professor Gabrielle Appleby and senior Uluru Dialogue member Eddie Synott wrote in March that voice precedes treaty because fair, modern treaty negotiations require first the establishment of a representative Indigenous body to negotiate the rules of the game with the state. They write it can't be left to the state alone, and the state must have a group of people with whom to negotiate. The Labor government has committed to implementing the 2017 Uluru Statement, and this includes a voice, treaty and truth-telling. Albanese has spoken about a Makarrata Commission to supervise treaties.
A clarion call for truth, treaty and voice, delayed and then dismissed. A generous statement to advance reconciliation that a Labor government will embrace and we will advocate at a referendum.
And there can be no reconciliation without treaty and truth-telling.
And both of those comments from Albanese and Linda Burney when they were in opposition in August 2021. But now Albanese is PM, and as you heard in that fiery interview with Ben Fordham yesterday, Albanese insists the voice is not about treaty.
As part of the Uluru Statement, we have a voice, we have treaty, we have truth-telling. As part of a treaty, won't there be compensation? If there is, I mean, that's not totally unexpected.
This isn't about a treaty, Ben.
But there are 3 parts of the Uluru Statement.
Yeah, and this is not.
So you're talking about the voice.
This is not about a treaty.
But as part of treaty, which we guess will be a following step.
This is not about a treaty.
Do you foresee that compensation would be paid?
This is not about a treaty.
But people want to know, will compensation be paid?
Can I make one point? No, Ben. I can't say it any clearer. Okay. Compensation has nothing to do with what people will vote on in the last quarter of this year.
No, I'm talking about after that.
And can I make that? Well, they're not voting on any of that.
No, I was just saying there are 3 stages. So after we go through the voice, is it natural to assume that as part of treaty...
No, it's not natural
so Thomas Mayo's
to go
wrong?
Through all the hypotheticals. I'm talking about what is on the agenda.
Well, today Ben Fordham fact-checked his interview with the Prime Minister, and he accused Albanese of misleading Australians about this point about treaty.
He's previously been very supportive of the idea of a national treaty with First Nations people. But the fears of compensation and paying the rent are clearly damaging support for the voice. So the Prime Minister's trying to remove the idea from voters' minds. But don't be fooled. We may not be voting on treaty and truth-telling at the referendum, but it is on the government's agenda. And we've heard it direct from the Prime Minister.
And this question of treaty also on the front page of the Australian today. But it's not the only area where the Prime Minister is being accused of misleading Australians on the voice. Albanese told Fordham that no politicians took any interest in his legislation or moved any amendments to change the wording. But have a look at this.
No. The difference here is, Ben, that this isn't about me. This is about Indigenous Australians and their request that they have made. And this went through, bear in mind, this went through the Senate without any amendment. Not one senator nor one House of Representatives member suggested or moved an amendment, which they were entitled to do,
He couldn't have been clearer. Not one senator, not one House of Representatives member moved an amendment. But it turns out that actually at least 3 politicians had moved amendments: Julian Leeser, Richard Colbeck and Lydia Thorpe. Have a look.
I give the call to the member for Barara.
I move amendments 1 and 2 as circulated in my name together. Mr Speaker, I move these amendments as a supporter of the yes case and as someone who will campaign for a yes vote in the referendum. I believe the constitutional recognition expressed through the creation of the voice, nationally and fed through from the local and regional levels.
I don't know what the PM's doing. I don't know whether he's misleading or whether he's just not across the details, because it happened not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Look, on the question of treaty, maybe Australians will support treaty. Maybe this isn't a big deal, but the PM does need to be upfront with voters ahead of the referendum. And the Coalition has also accused the Prime Minister of giving misleading advice about the power of the voice. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor said the voice's broad scope means that if Parliament restricts the voice, it could be challenged in the High Court.
This is a very broad wording that we are voting on, which will give the voice capacity to intervene on a very broad range of matters, well beyond Indigenous affairs. And any attempt from the government to restrict that, of course, can be challenged in the High Court. So the Prime Minister needs to be honest with Australians about the breadth of what is being proposed here.
And again, Labor completely rejects this, and Linda Burney says they do not have to accept the advice that the voice puts forward. But I want to look at some other areas where Anthony Albanese is also giving conflicting statements, because it's very confusing, the information that comes out of the Prime Minister's mouth from one day to the next. Look at the Commonwealth Games. At first, he said this decision to cancel it had been in the wind for some time.
Obviously, it's not something that we were anticipating, given that it's been in the wind for some time.
But then today he said he had no idea that it would be cancelled, and the whole thing came as a shock.
It's nonsense, like a lot of what Mr Pasuto says, complete nonsense. This was a decision by the Victorian government.
This is what voters are grappling with when it comes to the voice. The Prime Minister and Linda Burney are asking voters to trust them about what issues the voice will apply to, how much power it will have, and whether it will lead to treaty. But there's been a very clear erosion of voter trust in the Albanese government. It's reflected in the polls, and this after the Prime Minister's handling of the Katie Gallagher misleading the Senate issue. That's when it started to drop. Also, after he promised life would be cheaper, cost of living would be easier under his government. But as you know, everything is now far more expensive. Meanwhile, another under fire Labor leader, Daniel Andrews, is now for the 3rd day in a row facing accusations that he too has been misleading and maybe even lied over his account of the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. As we revealed on this show last night, a federal government committee led by Bridget McKenzie is now set to investigate Andrews' decision to cancel the Games. But it already looks like the Premier's version of events is coming unstuck. Where did his figure, the $6 to $7 billion estimate, where did this come from? Well, the Vice President of the Commonwealth Games Federation told the ABC that assurances were made by the Victorian government at the highest level that the budget for the Games was under control. She said that last month's budget update had the cost of the Games around the $3 billion mark, nowhere near the figure of $7 billion that Andrews keeps citing.
The last time there was any conversation at the board table around figures around Victoria, it was getting up towards the $3 billion conversation. More generally, the original budget was around $2.5 billion, if I recall correctly. So certainly that $6 to $7 billion was not something that we had ever heard, and certainly we're not projecting those types of figures at all.
And then in the newspaper today, Damon Johnston and John Ferguson write that the Premier was warned Victoria wouldn't be ready to host the 2026 Games before he made the bid. They cite a 2019 report funded by Daniel Andrews' own government, that recommended a bid for no earlier than 2034. But as you know, Daniel Andrews went ahead and bid for the Games anyway, announcing Victoria would be the host city in a celebratory press conference just 15 months ago.
The Victorian Government has just signed an exclusive negotiation agreement with the Commonwealth Games Federation to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games. This exclusivity speaks to the fact that we are the sporting capital of our nation. We have all that is needed to make an event like this a fantastic success for us and for everybody right across the Commonwealth.